From inside the MASN newsroom, it is the MASN All Access Podcast. Paul Mancano here with you, as always, joined via Zoom by Brendan Mortensen on this Thursday afternoon in what has been the longest week of all of our lives, and it is just Thursday. Brendan, thanks so much for hopping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
We're going to talk about some Orioles topics in just a bit. The Yolmer Sanchez waiver claim. We're going to talk about Jose Iglesias, of course, returning to the Orioles as they picked up his option, kind of predict what the infield will look like in 2021. And then I'm going to talk to Steve Klauke about Isaac Mattson, a prospect that entered the Orioles system about a year ago in the Dylan Bundy trade from the Angels organization. But first, Brendan, got to talk about everything that happened Tuesday night. Crazy announcements being made, live broadcast, everybody tuning in. Of course, I'm talking about the Gold Glove Awards.
Yes, that was the biggest event happening on Tuesday night. Shout out to Major League Baseball for scheduling that perfectly on a night where they had the entire baseball world's full attention and they were not focused anywhere else. I could not think of a better night to schedule the announcement of the Gold Glove Awards. I just couldn't.
I was preparing to come on this podcast and just rip the schedule makers who put this on the schedule for Tuesday election night. But as I was driving in, I was listening to Sirius XM MLB radio, and Mike Farron said that, and who knows, he could be very well wrong, but he said that the viewing audience for the Gold Gloves this year was higher than it was last year. How is that possible?
Seriously?
Who was tuning in? I'm sorry. I know Anthony Santander, of course, was up for a Gold Glove. He was a finalist in right field, and I turned in to watch that. But who was tuning into ESPN when the results were being announced to see the Gold Glove Awards? I'm sorry.
Now, my question is that a reflection of people still watching the Gold Glove Awards this year, or is it a reflection of the fact that nobody watched them ever?
Yeah, the bar might not have been
that's my question.
Very high. It kind of reminds me of, like, have you ever, tried to schedule something and you, like, if you're trying to schedule, like, a doctor's appointment and you're like, you got 9 a.m. on December 25th? That looks great. I can't see anything wrong with that. There's a wide open time. I don't know why it would be wide open, because it's Christmas Day. Like, you blow it by realizing, like, there's a reason that time slot was open for ESPN, and they gave them that time slot, and the person who was checking the calendar for MLB was like, yeah, Tuesday, middle of the week, it's a night in November, don't see anything wrong with that, without even realizing what was going on.
There wasn't one person who went, now wait a minute. Not one.
Yeah, no, and it's like they also build election night into your Google Cal. So
yeah,
it's
very hard to forget about.
It kind of is. It's almost like it happens every 4 years, and we're just kind of waiting for it. But Anthony Santander, of course, coming up short for the Gold Glove in right field in the American League, but an honor to be nominated, especially considering he played 37 games. And I know right field is not a defensively premier position, but for Santander, who honestly a couple years ago was not a very good defender at all, to be nominated, to be a finalist for a Gold Glove Award, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Anthony Santander's bat. That was usually the thing all year that was getting him most of the attention. But to even be nominated for the Gold Glove is really big for Anthony Santander. I mean, Joey Gallo, the winner, was very deserving. He's one of the better defensive right fielders in all of Major League Baseball and, of course, the American League. But for Santander, it's just a really good sign that both areas of his game are really improving.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's switch to the other Orioles news of the week. Two moves in the Orioles infield that were made in the past week. Let's start with the first move that was made. I think it was chronologically the first move. It was the more important move regardless, and that was Jose Iglesias on Sunday afternoon getting his $3.5 million option picked up by the Baltimore Orioles. Brendan, what was your first reaction considering this happened on the very last day that the Orioles just could pick up his option, and they did?
Well, I was a little skeptical that they would pick up his option because they waited so long to do it. But once they did, I really wasn't surprised. I think Jose Iglesias just played too well last year to not bring back on a contract. I was on the podcast a few weeks ago fanboying over the idea of bringing in like an Andrelton Simmons or something like that. But I think when you have Jose Iglesias already on the roster, he's already established himself with the Orioles within the lineup, within the clubhouse. He was just too good of a player last year not to bring back. I mean, Michael Elias said that it was pretty much a no-brainer. He could have been an MVP candidate last year, Elias's words, if he had played the entire season. So, while I don't think Iglesias is going to put up MVP numbers next season, and I don't think he's going to find himself in the 3-hole very often, he's still a really solid shortstop for the O's. And while he may not be the long-term solution at that position, he's certainly a good temporary fit there, both defensively and offensively. His bat exploded last year, the best of his career. So it really wasn't a question of whether or not they should bring Jose Iglesias back. It was just whether or not they would, and they ended up doing it, and I think it's a good move.
Yeah, and Michael Elias kind of played down the idea that it was, he said it was a no-brainer. It was not a difficult decision. And the reason he gave for waiting as long as they did to pick up the option was that, it's always just good to use the time afforded to you. And, if you can use those 4 days or 3 days after the World Series ends to try to gather all the information that you have and wait as long as you can to make the decision and take as much time to think it over, why not do it? But I do understand why it created some apprehension, because there were options being declined all around baseball. And we've talked about it on this podcast. This offseason is going to be the most confusing, unknowable offseason that we've seen in a long time, because we just don't know where these teams stand financially. With no fans in the stands for the regular season, with a shortened season, it's difficult to know, and the team's financial situations are not public knowledge. And another thing that, it's a capless league, so it's not like we know exactly what the cap is, and teams can spend up to that amount. Teams can spend as much or as little as they want during this offseason. And while Jose Iglesias, on paper, it made absolute sense, total bargain to bring him back at $3.5 million, you just don't know how much money the Orioles have on hand and how much and where they want to allocate those funds. Because on the baseball side, I think it made absolute perfect sense. It was just, we don't know. We don't know how much they have on hand, and we don't know how willing they are to spend this free agency. I think this is probably going to be at $3.5 million, the most expensive deal that they make this offseason.
Probably the most expensive deal, but like you said, he's still a bargain at $3.5 million. Shortstop is a premier position. You will have a very hard time finding somebody in free agency that is going to give you as much value as Jose Iglesias does at the shortstop position for less than $3.5 million. I would argue that you probably can't at all. I think it's nearly impossible. We were talking about a guy like Andrelton Simmons. He was going to cost you a lot more than $3.5 million a year. He was probably going to be up somewhere near $8-9 million a year if he's going to sign somewhere in the offseason. So I think for the Orioles, where you're looking at that value of guys that could potentially be in the free agent market, Iglesias and his value contract-wise is just better than any of those guys.
Yeah, and with all these teams uncertain, this kind of leads into our next topic. All these teams being uncertain about where they are going to spend their money and how much they are willing to spend. That contract, that $3.5 million for Jose Iglesias, not only makes him affordable for the Orioles, but makes him very affordable for other teams that might be willing to trade for him, whether it comes later this offseason or early next season or right at the trade deadline next year. Because if teams are really this scared of spending money this free agency, you have Jose Iglesias making 3.5, and then you have a number of guys on this team that are right in the middle of their arbitration years that are not making much money at all, that make them probably more attractive trade options because teams don't want to spend in free agency. They may be willing to give up a lower-level prospect or a couple international signings as opposed to going out and spending $10 million on a guy who's going to be a stopgap for a year or two.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the players for the Orioles that are arbitration eligible are valuable trade pieces, at least in some way. I think there's probably only one or two guys on that list that I look at and say, I don't know if the Orioles will be able to trade them to a contending team at the deadline, but pretty much everybody else is going to offer some kind of value to a team at the deadline if they want to get dealt at some point this season.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into that now because we're going to talk about Yolmer Sanchez in a second, and he is arbitration eligible. But the Orioles currently, as it stands, have 8 arbitration eligible players on their roster: Hanser Alberto, Renato Nunez, Yolmer Sanchez, Trey Mancini, Anthony Santander, Pedro Severino, Sean Armstrong, and Pat Valaika. So those are 8 guys that they have on their roster that are arbitration eligible. And it's impossible right now, especially with the 60-game season, it's impossible to know exactly how much these guys are going to make in arbitration. But MLBTradeRumors.com does a pretty good job of trying to estimate, given their previous numbers and their history, of how much these guys are going to make. And all of these guys, of course, because they are arbitration eligible, are eligible to be non-tendered in a couple weeks when that deadline comes up in the first week of December. So the Orioles might be trying these next 3 or 4 weeks. Might be a good time for the Orioles to try to decide if they want to trade these guys. And actually, they may make a move or two before they get into the winter meetings territory in the middle of December with one of the guys that is arbitration eligible.
Yeah, I'm looking at the list, and I think right now the only one that I think will probably be non-tendered if the Orioles can't find a deal for him is Pat Valaika.
Yeah.
I think,
1.1 million right now for Pat Valaika is the predicted value, which it seems like that's probably a little too rich considering, especially the Orioles bring back Stevie Wilkerson, who we said fills somewhat of a similar role. We saw Ramon Urias last year as a valuable utility infielder. Yeah, I agree. I think that might be a little too rich for their blood.
Yeah, and I think Sean Armstrong, presents you with good value. He's teetering that line a little bit of a possible non-tender, but given the season that he had last year, I think at the very least he could garner some trade consideration, even if the Orioles can't make a move for him. But pretty much everybody else on the list, Yolmer Sanchez, the Orioles just brought in, Alberto, Nunez, Mancini, Santander, and Severino. Those are all guys that you can either keep on the roster for their arbitration money or try to make a deal for, because I think all of them have enough value that they would garner interest from other teams.
Yeah, I mean, so the most amount that is projected is, of course, Trey Mancini, who's projected, I think he's going into his second year of arbitration eligibility, so he is projected at this point to make $4.8 million. He's obviously not going anywhere, so you have that locked up. Then there's kind of the middle territory, where you have Hanser Alberto, who is projected at this point to make $2.3 million. You have Renato Nunez, who's projected to make $2.1 million. We've talked quite a lot about Renato Nunez being a potential trade chip for Mike Elias. And then below that, Anthony Santander at $1.7 million. We've talked about him potentially as a trade chip, but we think he's most likely to stay. Those first 2 guys, Alberto and Nunez, do you think because of this uncertainty this offseason with teams that the Orioles might try to trade Hanser Alberto and Renato Nunez, one of the 2?
I think at least one of them will get dealt. We've talked about on the podcast, like you said, a lot about Renato Nunez and how he might kind of be the odd man out in this Orioles lineup. I think of those 2, there's a pretty good chance that Nunez gets dealt before Alberto. I think Orioles fans know that a lot of the value of Hanser Alberto doesn't necessarily come on the field because he's such an important part of the team in that clubhouse. He's a big team leader, and I would honestly be surprised if the Orioles tried to move him, because although he doesn't offer you the most value offensively, defensively, on the field of the guys on this list, I think he gives you so much value off the field that he would be a tough guy to trade in that regard. So I think Renato Nunez is probably the name that I'm looking at the most and saying, okay, the Orioles might try to move him with that arbitration value. I think that 2.1 million number, if you can't find a trade home for Renato Nunez, that's not an outlandish number. I think you can keep him on the roster for that. But ideally, because he's probably not going to get a ton of playing time with Mancini, Mountcastle, and the crowded outfield like we talked about, I think ideally you'd probably like to trade him.
I do think they probably prefer to trade him at this point. I wouldn't rule out non-tendering, though. If there is not a trade partner out there, would they bring back? We just don't know how much money they have and how willing they are to spend it at this point. So I think in a normal offseason, absolutely, you would bring him back at $2.1 million, but especially considering he might not have a spot on the diamond next year or the DH spot, I think they might non-tender, potentially Renato Nunez. I think they're really hoping that they can trade him.
Yeah, the non-tender for me with Nunez is just tough because he's too good of a player to non-tender, in my opinion.
Probably, yeah. But I think he teeters on the edge. He's just not. If he were a more consistent player, if they had a definite spot for him next year, and it's difficult because you look at, a guy like Rio Ruiz, who is not arbitration eligible. He is a better defensive player, obviously, but not a very, doesn't bring nearly what Renato Nunez does offensively. He's probably much likelier to be on the roster next year, not just because he has a spot in the infield, but also because he's going to be much cheaper.
Yes, but let's not forget too that Renato Nunez offensively, he's 2 years removed from 31 homers and 90 RBIs. Yeah. That's still a valuable bat in anybody's lineup, I would think. And while he is very streaky, we know Nunez can, hit 200 for a week and then hit 400 the next. And he's going to hit somewhere in the mid 200s probably. He'll hit somewhere around 240, 250. But I just have a hard time looking at 31 homers, 90 RBIs and thinking that doesn't have a place on the Orioles roster and doesn't hold some value in a trade.
Yeah. I think, like I said, I think they're hoping to trade him, but I think another candidate, too, to be non-tendered, I think Pedro Severino is a low-key candidate to be non-tendered. I really don't know what kind of trade value he has, considering the second half of the season that he had, and he finished hitting about 267. A little bit of pop, not a good defensive catcher at this point, and you and I both like Pedro Severino, but $1.4 million. Would you keep him on the roster next year, considering you might be seeing Adley Rutschman make his major league debut in 2021? You already have Chance Sisco. Is he an odd man out in this situation?
Personally, if I'm Mike Elias, I'm not, and right now, obviously, I'm not making the money decisions, but I would keep Pedro Severino for $1.4 million. I know that the Orioles might be looking to save some money someplace, and I think Severino is a possible candidate for that because, like you said, Adley Rutschman could be making his debut this season, and you have Chance Sisco, who I think is probably more valuable at this point than Severino. My thinking with Pedro Severino is that maybe you keep him on the roster for 2021, assuming that Adley isn't going to make his debut until the second half of next season.
Yeah.
Maybe Severino has a first half similar to like he did in 2020, plays lights out in the first half, and you get to the trade deadline, and he has some value for a team that really needs either a catcher or a backup catcher. And you can hope at that point that Severino will just be almost a rental for the Orioles.
Yeah.
Because you can have him for the first half of the 2021 season, hope that his trade value moves up or increases in some way, and then deal him to a team at the deadline, at which point, hopefully, Adley Rutschman will be able to make his debut relatively soon after that deadline. And then you can run another two-catcher rotation of Adley Rutschman and Chance Sisco backing him up. So personally, I would take the gamble and say, okay, for $1.4 million, we'll see if Severino can increase his value enough in the first half of 2021 to find a trade partner. But if the Orioles are looking to save money, it would not surprise me if Severino is non-tendered because they have Chance Sisco. And I think Severino as a backup catcher at that point doesn't offer you a ton of value, where you could get a cheaper backup catcher, even if it is an Austin Wynns who hasn't played great at the major league level, somebody like that who isn't going to cost you $1.5 million.
And Brian Holiday, too, as well as a guy that they currently have on their roster, a veteran guy who I guess at this point probably brings a little bit slightly better defensively behind the plate, but Severino's 27. I think Holiday's like 32 or 33. So, during this rebuild, we've said it a million times, you tend to lean towards youth, but if youth is going to cost you that much more money, you just might not do that this offseason. All right, let's talk about Yolmer Sanchez, because he is an arbitration-eligible player, but he was placed on waivers by the Chicago White Sox. He's 28 years old, and the Orioles picked him up. He's played all over the diamond. For the most part, he has played at second base, but he can play third, and Mike Elias said in his press conference earlier this week that they believe that he can play some shortstop if needed. I think Iglesias most likely is slotted in at shortstop. What do you think the addition of Yolmer Sanchez means for this infield?
Well, first of all, I think it means that Pat Valaika has probably seen his last days as an Oriole. I can't imagine that the Orioles pick him up with that arbitration we talked about. Over $1 million for Pat Valaika when you just picked up Yolmer Sanchez, who is probably giving you more value. I think it doesn't really make sense to bring back Valaika at that point. Mike Elias mentioned, like you said, that he could play second base and third base. I think that's probably where we see the most of Yolmer Sanchez. You can probably rotate him. I think the three-man rotation between second base and third base will be some combination of Sanchez, Rio Ruiz, and Hanser Alberto. I wouldn't be surprised if Sanchez is the opening day third baseman. I think he probably gives you similar, if not more value than Rio Ruiz. They're different offensively. Sanchez is going to hit for a better average. He hit .313, granted in just 16 at-bats in 2020. But he's a few years removed from leading the American League in triples in 2018 with 10. So he has a good contact bat. He's probably going to hit somewhere in the mid 250s, 5 to 10 home runs, and he's going to give you solid defense. I think if you're Brandon Hyde, you could look at Sanchez and say maybe he gives you more value than Rio Ruiz at third base. And if, you could rotate Hanser Alberto to second and third, you could rotate Sanchez and Rio Ruiz at third base as well. So I think he's going to find his playing time. Personally, I would start him more at third and keep Alberto at second, but you can really move him anywhere. And I think that's where a lot of his value comes from. And I think it's a really good pickup for the Orioles, especially if you're not planning on bringing back Pat Valaika.
Yeah, I think he fits the same type mold as Jose Iglesias in terms of typically a defense first guy. You mentioned the Gold Glove that he had, and he's probably not quite the defender that Jose Iglesias is at shortstop because he doesn't play that position, and he also doesn't. He's probably not up to that caliber defensively, but a similar type mold. And we saw the year that they got out of Jose Iglesias. They're probably hoping that they can do something similar there. But Mike Elias said, look, it's early in the offseason. A lot of times they make these waiver claims. We saw what happened last year to Carson Fulmer, and he spent a week on the team and made like 2 appearances, and then eventually they placed him on waivers again. So the roster at this point, they have the 40-man roster that they have to play with. They added him, and right now they have 5 open spots. So they can kind of, if they need to bring somebody up, if they need to add another prospect, if a Cody Sedlock to their 40-man roster when they're already going to add Diaz and Lowther and Wells and those guys, this might be one of those pickups that Sanchez is with them for like a week, and then they're like, all right, thanks so much. Sorry, you didn't get to be with us very long, but we have to put you back on waivers.
Yeah, realistically, I think I could also see Sanchez and Richie Martin kind of being the 2 utility infielders.
Right.
They'll kind of be the rotational guys behind Alberto, Iglesias, Ruiz, if those end up being your 3 starters at the non-first base infield positions. So I think having 2 of those guys would be valuable. We saw it this year with Pat Valaika and Andrew Velasquez, and I think you're kind of upgrading at both of those spots with Richie Martin and Yolmer Sanchez.
If you had to predict right now, opening day infield for the Baltimore Orioles, what would your infield look like?
So first base, it's kind of a toss-up for me personally. You can put Ryan Mountcastle there. You can put Trey Mancini there.
Yeah.
I think on opening day, no matter who is playing first base, it's going to be some combination of Mountcastle and Mancini at first base and DH. So you can throw those 2 on there. I'll say Mountcastle for now. Second base, I'm going to say Hanser Alberto. Shortstop, Jose Iglesias. And third base, I'm going to say Yolmer Sanchez. I think personally, he gives you more value than Rio Ruiz. Maybe they want to start Ruiz there, see if he can kind of pick up on those hot streaks that he had last season and continue those over a more consistent stretch in 2021. But I think Sanchez gives you a little bit more value at this point. So if I'm constructing the opening day lineup for the O's, I'm putting Sanchez at third base and hoping that Ruiz can be maybe a spark bat off the bench. And if Ruiz can put together some consistent at-bats, then sure, start him at third base and move Sanchez back into that rotational infield spot. But as it stands right now, I would start Sanchez at third base.
We don't know how big the rosters are going to be next year, but in that scenario, you have Rio Ruiz on the bench. Would you rather keep, just academically, Rio Ruiz or Richie Martin at the big league level? Or would you rather try to option one of those guys down to the Norfolk level?
I think at this point, I would probably keep Rio Ruiz at the major league level because Richie Martin 2 years ago didn't really like what we saw from him at all. He really didn't have too many stretches where he looked great. Rio Ruiz had some stretches last season where he looked really good.
Yeah.
He looked like he could be the Orioles' everyday third baseman. And if you can get those consistent stretches out of Rio Ruiz, then he could be a pretty solid option at third base for you. Whereas Richie Martin, I think, just needs some more work all around. We really didn't see those flashes from Richie Martin at any point 2 years ago. So if I had to choose one of the two, I would say Rio Ruiz. If we're throwing Rylan Bannon in there, I think I would rather have Rylan Bannon at the major league level at some point next season over a Richie Martin and over a Rio Ruiz. But
you're getting ahead of us. You're getting ahead.
Yes.
Because we're going to look at I want to ask next what you think the final Orioles infield will be, what the Orioles infield will be on the last day of the regular season, so to speak. But that's interesting. I mean, I think Richie Martin just is on the wrong end of having this injury. And if this were a full season, he probably would have missed a lot of time and then made his return because he would have been out, 6 to 8 weeks with that broken wrist. So he ended up missing the time and missing the entire season. So we didn't get to see if he made those improvements that we talked about last offseason that he needed to make offensively. I mean, he only hit about 220 back in 2019, but we had heard pretty much good things about him returning in 2020, making some changes at the plate. Maybe they weren't going to have him start every day, and that takes some pressure off him at shortstop. But it stinks for Richie Martin because we just don't get to see that. And Rio Ruiz didn't exactly take advantage of the opportunity that was given to him. We saw those flashes, especially at the beginning of the season, but by the end of the season, his production had really kind of fallen off a cliff from where it had started. I think it's going to come down, if those two guys are kind of battling for a spot, it could kind of come down to spring training and what Brandon Hyde and the coaching staff and Mike Elias see from those two guys in spring training, and they may have to try to send a guy down.
Yeah, and I don't want to anoint Sanchez as a Jose Iglesias type right now. I think there's probably a strong possibility that if we're talking about kind of a spring training battle between Rio Ruiz and Richie Martin, that Sanchez is probably part of that battle as well. This isn't a big name free agent that they brought in. It's not even a Jose Iglesias type free agent that we brought in. This is a guy who was waived from the White Sox a few weeks ago. So this isn't a player who is going to be the caliber of Jose Iglesias for the Orioles. I just think that he offers a better value than Rio Ruiz at this point, but not so far as to say that he is guaranteed even a roster spot, let alone an opening day starting position somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I had to predict my infield, and again, we don't know what the health of Trey Mancini is, we're hoping that he is ready to go 100% by opening day 2021. But of course, it's tough to bounce back from chemotherapy treatments that he has been undergoing for the last 8 or so months. So we're hoping that he is going to be able to play every day, but just not certain at this point. So let's just, academically, slot Trey Mancini into first base. We can put Ryan Mountcastle in left. I think Hanser Alberto is at second, and I don't feel great about that. I do think with that $2.3 million projected that he's going to get an arbitration, I think he could not potentially be on this team next year, whether it's a trade or unfortunately might have to be a non-tender, but I think it would probably much more likely be a trade than a non-tender at this point. But I think you have to slot him in there for right now, and then Jose Iglesias probably at shortstop, and yeah, I'm with you. Probably Yolmer Sanchez at third at this point, but it's totally wide open. I think this entire infield could look vastly different than what it looked like at the end of 2020 and what even we're predicting at this point.
Yeah, not only could it look vastly different, I think it could also look vastly different at the end of 2021.
Yep.
I think in the second half of the season, there's a possibility that Orioles starting infield includes maybe a Terran Vavra, maybe includes a Rylan Bannon. I think there's a possibility that both of those guys could be starting for the Orioles at those infield spots by the end of the year. I think that's entirely possible. If Hanser Alberto ends up being a guy that you just don't want to pay $2.5 million to, maybe Alberto doesn't make that team anymore. If Jose Iglesias is a guy who plays out of his mind again the first half of the season, maybe Jose Iglesias is traded at some point in the trade deadline. And then at third base, maybe Rio Ruiz just doesn't show you the flashes that you wanted to see out of Rio Ruiz. So if you're the Orioles, you could be looking at that infield and say, okay, maybe we need 3 different guys at those infield spots. There's a possibility at the end of 2021, maybe you have Caden Grenier starting at second base. Maybe you have Taron Vavra at short and Rylan Bannon at third.
Yeah,
I think that is entirely possible for the end of 2021 if you don't like the value that you're getting out of second and third, and maybe Jose Iglesias is just too good to not trade. So I think it is entirely possible that we could see a completely different Orioles infield at the end of the year than that we're getting at the beginning of the year.
And we're getting questions, of course, because we are live on Facebook and YouTube. If you are not watching, we are a visual experience as well as an audio experience. Jammer Daniels asking, why can't Richie Martin play second base? He can. He didn't play any games really at second base in 2019, but in the minor league level in 2018 in the A's organization, he had moved around the diamond, and the Orioles have talked up his defensive versatility. So maybe that's a possibility by the end of the 2021 season, and it could be at the beginning of the 2021 season. If they decide to move on from Hanser Alberto and trade him, maybe Richie Martin is starting on opening day at second base. I think that's a possibility. But like you said, at the end of the year, I think it's probably likely, if I had to put money on it, I think Rylan Bannon is probably your starting third baseman by the end of next season. I think that he is right there. He played at Norfolk 2 years ago in 2019 now. He didn't get any playing time, obviously, at the big league level this year, but he was at the alternate site near the end of the time there. He has defensive versatility, so he could play third. He could play second, probably at this point more of a third baseman. And I think they want to see what they have in him. He's a top 30 prospect, a guy that they got in the Manny Machado trade. And I think by the end of the year, I think he will get his call up, and we probably will see him play at third base. And then I think Jose Iglesias, I think that spot is probably going to be filled, I would think at this point, by Richie Martin. You mentioned Taron Vavra, Caden Grenier. Who else did you mention as infield prospects?
Those were the 3 that I thought could come up at the end of 21. It was Rylan Bannon and Taron Vavra and maybe Caden Grenier.
I'm not sure about Grenier just because we didn't see a whole lot of him. And of course, we're a year removed from actually seeing numbers on these guys, but he was at the high A level, didn't get to double A in 2019. And we didn't see enough like offensively production-wise from him. Not sure about him. And Vavra was also at the high A level. I think he could move up the organization quickly. Maybe there's a chance they bring him up in 2021. I think he's probably at this point a 2022 guy. But I think 2022 is when we start to see a lot of it. We might even see Vavra. We might see Gunnar Henderson. Who else might we? Maybe a Jordan Westberg. Yeah. All 3 of those guys can probably play shortstop too, which is exciting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those guys that you could probably slot into any infield position. I think, especially talk about Gunnar Henderson and Jordan Westberg, they're both bigger guys that kind of profile as third basemen at the major league level. So we'll see how they progress through the minor league level, if they are continuing to show good defense at shortstop or if maybe they need to move over to the hot corner. But I think there are a ton of possibilities for how the infield could shake up. There's a lot of possibilities for the outfield too, but I think for the infield, there are a lot of possibilities for how that could shake out. And there are a lot of good prospects that could come up and see time at third base, see time at shortstop, see time at second base too.
Yeah.
If the Orioles don't love their options at those positions right now.
Yeah. A lot of things in flux when it comes to this infield. And of course the outfield is going to be probably the most exciting position group for this team going forward in 2021 with Santander and Hayes and Mullins. Maybe Yusniel Diaz making his debut in 2021. On the pitching side, Mike Elias the other day was asked about starting pitching because you have the guys in the rotation as it stands. You have John Means. You have Alex Cobb, who we've talked about as a trade candidate. You have Keegan Aiken and Dean Kramer. And Mike Elias didn't necessarily commit to those 2 guys being in the rotation next year. But I think given their 2020 performance, I think you have to assume that they're going to be starting in 2021.
Yeah, I would be very surprised if they weren't.
Yeah.
If Mike Elias wants to go out and sign some veteran starting pitching, that's great. But I think you would much rather get a guy like Keegan Aiken starts over a 38-year-old free agent that they're going to sign.
Yeah.
You know, there's no point in not seeing what you have with the prospects who are coming up. And Keegan Aiken looked good last season.
Yeah.
And as did Dean Kramer. So personally, I think it would be crazy to not have those prospects in the starting rotation, because that's the whole point, right? Like you don't want to have the prospects be ready for the major league level and then say, all right, we'll just throw them in the bullpen.
Right. And,
and if they're starting pitching arms, start them.
Yeah. And Bruce Zimmerman is like not quite in that category, just because he's not as highly touted of a prospect as Kramer and Aiken. And he did struggle. He only got, the 2 or 3 appearances, but his first career start, he really did struggle, and he just doesn't quite, I don't think, have a spot solidified in that rotation. I think that 5th starter spot, assuming they don't trade Cobb this offseason, so they have Means, Cobb, Aiken, and Kramer. Mike Elias did say he is looking to add potentially during this free agent period on the starter side. And we'll roll that clip right now of what he's looking for in free agent starters. And he sounded pretty optimistic that they'll get a guy either on a major or minor league deal.
No, I definitely think we'll be signing some starting pitchers. I mean, you can never have enough. You see, even last year, we got the injury bug like every team does on a couple of our starters. So we're definitely going to need to sign some outsiders, whether it's a major or minor league deal. Will be case by case and TBD. But I think that Dean and Keegan's debuts went about as well as they should have gone, and we really liked what we saw from them. Just not results and stuff, but their professional demeanors, the way they carry themselves. I mean, I think any of you guys that watch the games were impressed with those aspects as well. Knowing that, there will be some additional competition next year in camp. This players have rough sophomore years sometimes, so to speak. That's all to be expected. So I don't think we're going to, lock anything in stone, and we want to have that competition. But they've certainly more than put themselves on the map, not just for the 2021 rotation, but we're hoping for the next 5 years or and beyond. That these are guys that are part of a playoff group here.
So when Mike Elias says he is looking for a veteran starter, Brendan, I think we can immediately assume they're going to be big-time players for Trevor Bauer.
I think so. When I think a Tommy Milone type, my brain immediately goes to former Cy Young winner Corey Kluber. It's somebody like that, somebody of that echelon that the Orioles would bring in. If not Corey Kluber or Trevor Bauer, you have to think they go after Charlie Morton. You just have to think that they go after these high caliber starting pitchers. But the point is that they're going to bring in somebody for, that 5th rotation spot who, in my opinion, probably isn't going to be there very long, considering you have a ton of these pitching prospects who you want to see what you have in them. Somebody like a Zach Lowther, Michael Baumann, all of these names that could come up in 2021, and you need to see what you have in them in the starting rotation. So I can't imagine that they're going to go out and sign somebody for a ton of money that is going to be guaranteed a starting rotation spot. So that's why I think they go after Chris Archer, bring him on a 1-year, $1 million deal. I can't see why Chris Archer wouldn't take something like that.
He was pretty bad in Pittsburgh. Talk about a guy whose value has pretty much tanked in the past couple years.
Yeah.
I think there are some candidates out there. I don't know. Chris Archer is still considered, I think he's still on that very, very end of a top 50 free agent list, which, by the way, this free agent class is not one of the best classes we've seen in a while.
It is not earth-shattering.
No. But the Orioles, we talked about on previous podcasts, the Orioles will kind of look around the market. And like you said, I think they're just kind of looking for a guy to fill in maybe as few as 7 starts, honestly, just to get them through the first couple months of the season, because these guys, if everything goes according to plan, and these guys are able to pitch in the minor leagues, knock on wood, those guys are going to be knocking on the door. Zach Lowther, Alexander Wells, Michael Baumann, those 3 in particular are going to be knocking on the door. And maybe Bruce Zimmerman starts pitching really well. Maybe they send him down to Norfolk, he starts crushing it, and they need to give him a spot. So they're really not at Mike Elias would very much like to do this offseason.
Yes, that definitive spot for Corey Kluber.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Another guy whose value has tanked in the past couple of years.
Yeah, but it's still Corey Kluber. But
still Corey Kluber. No, exactly.
Not only are those guys in the minor leagues knocking on the door, I think realistically you could start any one of them at the beginning of the 2021 season, and they would probably do a good job.
Yeah,
because they have shown pretty consistently at the minor league level that they are just about ready, if not ready, to make their major league debuts. So I think even holding them off a few months is just that. You're just holding them off. I think they are almost ready to be a consistent starter, hopefully, at the major league level, or at the very least, they are ready to show you what they potentially have at the major league level. So even if Mike Elias doesn't go out and sign a number 5 starter, personally, I would be confident in calling up any one of those 3 guys, having them be the number 5 starter at this point. I don't think Mike Elias is going to want to do that. I think he probably wants to bring in a veteran, like you said, even if it is just for 7-8 starts, somewhere around there. But personally, I'm ready for one of those 3. I hope that time comes sooner rather than later.
And a byproduct of the shutdown, I think we might have already seen one of those 3 guys at this point. If 2020 had been a normal season, I don't know which of the 3 it would have been. Maybe Michael Baumann, who, by the way, had that shoulder injury right at the end of his time at the alternate camp, and he is expected to be ready by spring training. So that probably won't change his outlook at all, but something to monitor. I think there's a chance we might have already seen one of those 3 guys, because I think at least 2 of those 3 guys would have started 2020 at Norfolk, and then you're just a call away from having to come up and make a start. But in that 60-game season, I totally understand why they played it conservatively.
Yeah, and we talked about on the podcast a few weeks ago some guys that Mike Elias could bring in. I wouldn't be surprised if he went after somebody like a Michael Wacha, was a name that you brought up.
I did.
Somebody who is just a veteran presence. They'll be able to make some starts here and there. If they pitch well, sure, you can keep them in the rotation and maybe look to deal them at the deadline or deal Alex Cobb or something like that.
Yeah.
But you want to bring in somebody who gives you enough flexibility to say, okay, you're not going to cost me a ton of money if we call up one of these prospects and all of a sudden you're no longer in the starting rotation. I'm not going to feel bad paying Corey Kluber $10 million only to have him get benched when a prospect comes up. You need somebody who is not going to cost you a lot, so it doesn't hurt you when you inevitably are probably going to call those prospects up that are going to take their job in the starting rotation.
Yeah, and either bump that veteran to the bullpen or try to trade that veteran at some point, which makes them more attractive as a trade piece if they have a lower salary as well, like we saw partly with Tommy Milone. Speaking of pitching, Brendan, before we toss to the interview with Steve Klauke to talk about Isaac Mattson, we should talk about the fact that Chris Holt is the Orioles' new pitching coach, taken over for Doug Brocail. He already was the director of pitching, which means he was working at the alternate site for the most part this year. I've talked to a lot of prospects who immediately mention him when I ask about guys that they have worked with in the organization that have helped their development. He's only been with this club since Mike Elias joined in November a couple of years ago, but he has already made a pretty strong impression on a lot of the young guys that are coming up through this system. And I think the best part about this is that he gets to continue that. All those names we have said numerous times, he has worked with personally, and he gets to continue that now by maintaining his role of director of pitching and now adding pitching coach at the major league level, where all the minor leaguers he just worked with are going to be coming up to Baltimore and be working with him at the big league level.
Yeah, it comes over from the Astros with Sig Mejdal and Mike Elias, so obviously he's already familiar with them. And probably this doesn't change his role with the pitchers a whole lot because he was already working with them a lot at the alternate site, like you said. This just gives him a nicer title. And I think he's probably going to continue to do a lot of the same things that he was doing last year. And listen, whatever he was doing at the alternate site, he's got to keep doing it, because the 2 pitchers that were called up for the Orioles last year that were the prominent prospects in Keegan Aiken and Dean Kramer, they both showed flashes of being really good starting pitchers potentially. So hopefully whatever he was doing at the alternate site last season, he continues to do as now he becomes the pitching coach for the O's.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of responsibility on his plate, honestly, to maintain the director of pitching title and also be a pitching coach at the big league level, but they have a lot of faith in this guy. Mike Elias obviously trusts him to be able to do it, and we know that these coaching staffs are going to be pared down around baseball, as we have already seen. And Darren Holmes moves from bullpen coach over to assistant pitching coach, and now they just have to replace Jose Flores over at third base, and they will have their coaching staff set for next season. And that is pretty much one of the final things that they have to do before they start getting into the depths of the player personnel decisions. And Brendan, we know that winter meetings will not be an in-person event this year, and I think that's a good thing for numerous reasons, but also probably good because I don't know what we would have to talk about a whole lot there, because it's not going to be like last year where you saw Anthony Rendon, Steven Strasburg, and Garrett Cole sign contracts on those 3 days of winter meetings. It's probably going to be a pretty slow winter, and things aren't going to heat up, I think, until we get into the new year.
I think winter meetings is pretty much just going to be follow Trevor Bauer on Twitter.
Yeah, he's probably going to be going live every day.
Probably.
I can expect that.
Yeah, Trevor Bauer will just be vlogging, and he will be keeping you updated with where he is thinking he wants to go in free agency, which, according to his Twitter, is everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty much going to be the most excitement we're going to get out of winter meetings. I don't know if it's going to be a very eventful free agency, but I think the Orioles will at least find one or two guys that are veterans that they can think that can come in, help the team a little bit, even if they aren't going to be big signings. I think they'll be maybe a number 5 starter, somebody who's going to help you in the bullpen, or maybe a utility guy somewhere. I think those are probably the signings to look for if you're the Orioles at this point.
Yeah, and especially watch over the next coming weeks. I think the deadline for non-tender is to non-tender guys who are arbitration eligible, as I drop my phone, I think it is December 2nd. So we are going to get probably some answers on where these guys are going to be, and which guys might be non-tendered, which guys might be traded or arbitration eligible over the next month or so. But Brendan, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast, and as always, enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul.
So let's get into the interview that I teased earlier. Steve Klauke, who was the broadcaster for Isaac Mattson's most recent team that was back in 2019, the Salt Lake Bees at the AAA level. Isaac Mattson, of course, one of the pieces, the most Major League ready piece of the Dylan Bundy trade that was made a year ago. Here's my interview. Now we're joined on the MASN All Access Podcast by Steve Klauke, who is the broadcaster for the Salt Lake Bees, one of the most recent teams, minor league teams, for Isaac Mattson, who entered the Orioles organization about a year ago. Steve, thanks so much for hopping on.
My pleasure, Paul.
So let's start with Isaac Mattson's journey to your team, because you only got him for 5 games, but that was because he was dominating at the AA level for most of the 2019 season. What did you know about Isaac before he got called up to the Bees?
Well, I knew that he was, from what I was told anyway, he was a bulldog kind of a guy, doesn't let much bother him out on the mound, and was a guy that was really liked to be in charge out there. He was a guy that, the Angels, I think, were pretty high on for a 19th round draft pick. He had really come through the system quickly.
So when he entered the Bees, he right at the tail end of the season, he had 5 appearances with you guys, as mentioned, just over 9 innings. What did you see from him in that small sample size?
Well, first of all, it was his fastball. And talking to our pitching coach that year, Pat Rice, it's not overpowering by any stretch of the imagination, 90 to 95 miles per hour, but an amazing spin rate from what he says. And his vertical movement was really the key. He says with that fastball and the vertical movement that he can put on that fastball, he's one of those few guys that might be capable, if the other stuff isn't working, he can still get by throwing nothing but fastballs. And the other stuff is still really a work in progress. But I just think the way he commanded himself out there, especially 19 strikeouts in 9 2/3 innings. And, he's facing guys who have gotten big league time. That's one of the special things about AAA. You really get your first true litmus test of what you can do because you're now facing guys who have been to the bigs.
Yeah, and especially getting called up mid-season like that and still experiencing the success that he did. You mentioned those 19 strikeouts. Obviously, for a reliever, those strikeout numbers should be pretty high, but is that a really good sign and a good indicator that he could translate that success as he moves onwards and upwards?
I think so. Again, talking with Pat Rice, he doesn't know if maybe a closing role would be his future in the big leagues, even though he's 10 for 10 in save opportunities in his minor league career. But I think he'd be the perfect, especially in this day and age of baseball, a setup guy in the 6th, 7th, or 8th inning.
And the fastball, that blistering fastball that you mentioned that has, a great spin rate, do you think that's part of the reason that they shifted him to the bullpen? He was a bullpen guy when you got him, but at the lower levels of the minor league, do you think maybe that blow-him-away fastball was the pitch that kind of set him over the edge and pushed him into the bullpen?
Yeah, I really think so. I mean, the Angels, when they drafted him, started him out in the bullpen. Then in 2018, they did experiment with him as a starter. He had 11 starts at the lower levels, and they went okay, but I think they realized with the kind of stuff that he has, and, in this day and age, too, at 92, 95 miles per hour, probably not going to, no matter what kind of spin rate you have, what kind of movement you have, you might have troubles the second time through the order. So I think a relief situation, a setup guy in the 6th, 7th, and 8th is his future.
If he had stayed in the organization, this is going to be a tough question to kind of look and extrapolate into the future. And if 2020 had been a normal season, do you think that he would have started the season with you guys, but do you think he would have gotten his call up to the big league level at some point during 2020?
No doubt, Paul. If he was successful at our level, he would definitely have gotten the opportunity. One thing about the Angels organization the last few years, they give guys opportunities. I know because of all the movement, we've set franchise records. Last season that we played, 2019, I believe we had 264 transactions between the Angels and our ball club and Double-A. So he definitely would have gotten the opportunity to test the waters.
And in terms of his personality, I interviewed him about a year ago when he entered the Orioles organization. It was over Zoom, so I couldn't get a great sense, but it seemed like he was a very smart guy, a good guy, and a hardworking guy. Is that the sense that you got from him in the short time he was with the Bees?
Absolutely, Paul. I talked to a couple of his Bees teammates who had been with him down at the lower levels, and they all had high praise of the kind of makeup that Isaac has. So I think, I always talk about, Mike Trout having that sixth tool between his ears, and I think Isaac may be one of those guys that has that tool between his ears, that he's very smart in the way he approaches the game.
That's great to hear, and hopefully Orioles fans will get a look at him at some point in the near future, maybe an invite to spring training, and maybe they'll see him in some games up in Baltimore in 2021. But in the meantime, Steve, thanks so much for hopping on the MASN All Access podcast and sharing your insight.
Anytime, Paul.